Hello and welcome back to Speech Spotlight. My name is James Derry and I am your host. And today I think I have something very special for you guys. We are going to be looking at George Washington, and not just one George Washington speech, but we are going to be going through two George Washington speeches. We will be looking at his resignation from the Revolutionary military, the Revolutionary Army, and then we are going to be looking at his first inaugural address as President of the United States of America. So this first speech is going to be directed at the President of the Congress. So don't get too confused when you see George Washington addressing this to Mr. President. He was the first president, and this is referring to Congress. So that's a little fun, but yeah, let's just jump into it. And remember, if you like what we talk about, give it a like. If you dislike these speeches, I mean, they're George Washington, so I don't know how you could, but you know where that button is. And make sure to leave your comments below about what you think of George Washington, or if any of this surprises you, because this is really more about the character of George Washington than anything else. This isn't going to be really about politics. You'll see a bit of that, but for the most part, this is about the way George Washington views the country and views himself. So, let's get into it. Mr. President, the great events on which my resignation depends have at length taken place. I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress, and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country. Happy in the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty, and pleased with the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation, I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence, a diffidence of my abilities to accomplish so arduous a task, which, however, was superseded by a confidence in the rectitude of our cause, the support of the supreme power of the Union, and the patronage of heaven. The successful termination of the war has verified the most sanguine expectations, and my gratitude for the interposition of Providence and the assistance I have received from my countrymen increases with every review of the momentous contest. While I repeat my obligations to the army in general, I should do injustice to my own feelings not to acknowledge in this place the peculiar services and distinguished merits of the gentlemen who have been attached to my person during the war. It was impossible the choice of confidence officers to compose my family should have been more fortunate. Permit me, sir, to recommend in particular those who have continued in the service to the present moment as worthy of the favorable notice and patronage of Congress. I consider it as indispensable duty to close this last act of my official life by commending the interest of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have superintendence of them to his holy keeping. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employment of public life. I apologize for tripping over a few spots, but yeah, this is a very simple and straightforward resignation address. I really appreciate the candor with which George Washington speaks here. This is the first George Washington speech I have ever read through. I never had to read through them in school. I never had to read through them in any part of my education. I was always told how great George Washington was, but I never really had the opportunity, or really I wouldn't say but the initiation to read some of his speeches, some of his writings, or any of that nature. He speaks very well, I find, with utmost dignity. And I just want to highlight that in this address, when he mentions where he started from when he accepted the appointment to lead the military, to lead the army, he did it with diffidence. And I didn't know what diffidence meant before I first looked at this speech, before presenting it to you guys. I wanted to make sure there weren't any words I would really struggle with too much. But diffidence was one of the ones I didn't know. And it really means a shyness and almost a lack of self-confidence to a point. A lack of faith that one could really achieve what is before them. That seems to be what he's talking about. So when he says diffidence, at first the president and the Congress might think, oh, he was thinking that he didn't necessarily have faith in the country, in the military, but no, he was lacking confidence in himself, and he was very worried he wouldn't be able to accomplish what he managed to accomplish within our military. And then he managed to overcome his lack of confidence by having all of the confidence in the world in the cause, in the movement of the army to become and form this free and sovereign nation based on liberty. It really is a very inspiring thing that George Washington, one of the great founders of our country, he was a shy and fairly regular man. And I think that's really important for the ethos of what the U.S. was meant to be. We weren't, the country itself was always designed to be grand, but it's not necessarily that our leaders were designed to be grand or more than men. Our original president, as chosen, he was a humble man. He was chosen because he was chosen despite his own inhibitions, despite his own faith in himself, and maybe even you could say because of those things, that humble attitude, that the way he approached things, it connected with people. And I think that's something that really is lost over time. And people will definitely say, oh, look at Trump. But honestly, you can really see that there isn't this type of presentation with almost anyone in public life, anyone in our modern politics. So it's nice to look back on this and hear from Washington. And I think it's only appropriate that I follow this up with a look at his first inaugural address. So, as you can imagine, Washington getting elected president was a bit of a surprise to him. He resigned and left public life just a few years before, and suddenly 5 years later or so, he's being brought back in to give his address as the first president of the United States. So let's get into this one. Among the vicissitudes incident to life, no event could have filled me with greater anxieties than that of which the notification was transmitted by your order and received on the 14th day of the present month. On the one hand, I was summoned by my country, whose voice I can never hear but with veneration and love, from a retreat which I had chosen with the fondest predilection, and, in my flattering hopes, with an immutable decision, as the asylum of my declining years, a retreat which was rendered every day more necessary as well as more dear to me by the addition of habit to inclination, and of frequent interruptions in my health and the gradual waste committed on it by time. On the other hand, the magnitude and difficulty of the trust to which the voice of my country called me, being sufficient to awaken in the wisest and most experienced of her citizens a distrustful scrutiny into his qualifications, could not but overwhelm with despondence one who, inherently inferior endowments from nature and unpracticed in the duties of civil administration, ought to be peculiarly peculiar. I apologize for not being able to say peculiarly. Peculiarly. I apologize for this. Conscious of his own deficiencies. In this conflict of emotions, all I dare ever is that it has been my faithful study to collect my duty from a just appreciation of every circumstance by which it might be affected. All I dare hope is that if, in executing this task, I have been too much swayed by a grateful remembrance of former instances or by an affectionate sensibility to this transcendent proof of the confidence of my fellow citizens, and have thence too little consulted my incapability as well as disinclination for the weighty and untried cares before me, my error will be palatable by the motives which mislead me, and its consequences be judged by my country with some share of partiality in which they originated. Such being the impressions under which I have, in obedience to the public summons, repaired to the present station, it would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplication to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes, and may enable every instrument employed in its administration to execute with success the functions allotted to his charge. In tendering this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large less than either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency, and in the important revolution just accomplished in the system of their united government, the tranquil deliberation and voluntary consent of so many distinct communities from which the event has resulted cannot be compared with the means by which most governments have been established without some return of pious gratitude, along with a humble anticipation of the future blessings which the past seemed to presage. These reflections arise out of the present crisis, have forced themselves too strongly on my mind to be suppressed. You will join with me, I trust, in thinking that there are none under the influence of which the proceedings of a new and free government can more auspiciously commence. By the article establishing the executive department, it is made the duty of the President to recommend to your consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. The circumstances under which I now meet you will acquit me from entering into that subject further than to refer to the great constitutional charter under which you are assembled, and which, in defining your power, designates the objectives to which your attention is to be given. It will be more consistent with those circumstances and far more congenial with the feelings which actuate me, to substitute, in place of a recommendation of particular measures, the tribute that is due to the talents, the rectitudes, and the patriotism which adorn the characters selected to devise and adopt them. In these honorable qualifications, I behold the surest pledges that as on one side no local prejudices or attachments, no separate views nor party animosities will misdirect the comprehensive and equal eye which ought to watch over this great assemblage of communities and interests. So, on another, that the foundation of our national policy will be laid in a pure and immutable principle of private morality, and the preeminence of free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world. I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nation an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. Since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the republican model of government are justly considered, perhaps as deeply as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. Besides the ordinary objects submitted to your care, it will remain with your judgment to decide how far an exercise of the occasional power delegated by the fifth article of the Constitution is rendered expedient at the present juncture by the nature of objections which have been urged against the system, and by the degree of inquietude which has given birth to them. Instead of undertaking particular recommendations on this subject, in which I could be guided by no light derived from official opportunities, I shall again give way to my entire confidence in your discernment in pursuit of the public good. For I assure myself that whilst you carefully avoid every alteration which might endanger the benefits of a united and effective government, or which ought to await the future lessons of experience, a reverence for the characteristic rights of free men and a regard for the public harmony will sufficiently influence your deliberations on the question how far the former can be impregnably fortified, and the latter be safely and advantageously promoted. To the foregoing observation, I have one to add, which will be the most properly addressed to the House of Representatives. It concerns myself and will therefore be as brief as possible. When I was first honored with a call into the service of my country, then on the eve of an arduous struggle for its liberties, the light in which I contemplated, my duty required that I should renounce every pecuniary compensation. From this resolution, I have in no instance departed, and being still under the impression which produced it, I must decline as inapplicable to myself any share in a personal emoluments which may be indispensably included in a permanent provision for the executive department, and must accordingly pray that the pecuniary estimation for the station in which I am placed may during my continuance in it be limited to such actual expenditure as the public good may be thought to require. Having thus imparted you with my sentiments as they have been awakened by the occasion which brings us together, I shall take my present leave, but not without resorting once more to the benign parent of the human race in humble supplication that, since he has been pleased to favor the American people with opportunities for deliberation in perfect tranquility, and disposition for deciding the unparalleled unanimity on a form of government for the security of their union and the advancement of their happiness, so his divine blessing may be equally conspicuous in the enlarged views, the temperate consultations, and the wise measures on which the success of the government must depend. Whew, that was a pretty big one. Maybe I should have checked that before making this a double, but anyhow, there's a lot to break down here with what George Washington was saying. He starts a little funny because he initially talks about how he was very surprised and filled with anxiety with being called to be president. He saw it as a duty and an obligation to answer the call of his country. He did not see it as something he wanted to do. He did not see it as even a choice. In Washington's eyes, the nation calling upon him was like receiving a message from God. It is a duty, and no matter how much he personally feels like he's lacking confidence or lacking the proper education and strength to fill this role, he still comes in and says, "You have called on me, so I will do it." There's a sense of hope there. Despite even a lack of confidence, there is that sense of hope. And he has trust, not necessarily in himself, but that there is a reason that he was called upon. He has trust in God, in his Congress, in his people, that he was brought into the position he was brought into, not as a means of gaining power, but as a means to lead in a way that he has been asked to. It's really a fascinating way to look at leadership, not as gaining power, but as a duty to fulfill a role. It's a very interesting way of thinking of things, because reading what George Washington is saying, it's almost as though the leader has no power. And this follows a bit of a model for federalism that I've been considering recently, where really, if you think of federalism as almost inverting the power hierarchy of feudalism, where in feudalism the king is the sole decision maker, he's the leader. In federalism, it works its way up from the people, or at the very least the representatives of the people, in a federalist republic. At the very least, it works its way from the people choose their representatives. There are many representatives who may choose the senators and congressmen, as well as choosing the president, who, while being at the head, you can see in the way George Washington is talking about this, he actually expressly, where was that? Which was so long. He expressly brought up that he wanted to not really claim power, but leave a lot of decisions up to the Congress themselves. Let me see if I can find that paragraph, because I got a little lost even just while reading it. Yeah, so he's saying it would be wrong for him to deny the call here, because he sees it as being due to Almighty Being. He refers to God, essentially, as well as the public summons. So he's referring to the people and the representatives of the people choosing him. He also refers to God as a great author. So that's a very interesting metaphor. So there's actually a lot to break down here, but there is that one thing I want to talk about, if I can. Yeah, here we go. By the articles establishing the executive department, it is made the duty of the president to recommend to the consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Essentially, he can present bills to the Congress. Is a way to interpret that. That's my initial interpretation, though. I like Washington here. He says, "The circumstances under which I now meet you will acquit me from entering into that subject further than to refer to the great constitutional charter under which you assemble, and which, in defining your powers, designates the objects to which your attention to be given." So it sounds like he's saying he's basically leaving it up to Congress in a lot of ways. And I find that a little bit funny, because right now we have a situation where a lot of times people are telling the president, "Oh, the president has to do this. The president has to do this." Whenever there's it seems like in modern times, a lot of blame just goes on the presidency for anything that goes wrong or right, for that matter. Whereas our Constitution really did give much more power to Congress in the way it was written. Of course, Congress is the legislature, and they're the ones who make the laws, and they're also the ones who are voted in by the representatives of the state, and they are representatives of the state. They're brought in by the electorate, who the citizens who are voting were able to essentially pick, and then the electorate puts in the House of Representatives and the Senate. So there's a surprising amount of there's a surprising amount of just openness on the way in which George Washington speaks, because it is so very humble. Besides the ordinary objects submitted to your care, it will remain with your judgment to decide how far an exercise of the occasional power delegated by the 5th article of the Constitution is rendered expedient at the present juncture by the nature of objections which have been urged against the system, and by the degrees of quietude which has given birth to them. So I believe this is him also commenting not only on how to approach power in general, but how to approach the arguments against the initial form of the U.S. Constitution. These arguments were being made generally by the anti-federalists at this time, who were upset at things like us not having a Bill of Rights. So I appreciate that in his very first address as president, George Washington is like, you're the ones representing people. I represent the whole country, but you represent your people. It's up to you. You should be the ones to deliberate and decide what our legal system will be. That's why he leaves it up to the House of Representatives. So I do like just there's a lot to say about Washington's character. He mentioned that he isn't even part of a party, and that it is his duty to serve all Americans, which we haven't had a president since who really fits that role. Washington was not a Whig, he was not a Republican, he was not a Democrat, he was not he wasn't even, you couldn't even say he was a Federalist and not an anti-Federalist. He was very simply a man who was called to serve his country, and he filled that role. He was a shy and unsure man who came to fill the role that was asked of him. Some people would say the presidency was bestowed upon him, as though it was granting him a gift. But to him, it pulled him out of retirement. It was hard on him, as you can see in these first few paragraphs. He's like, I was retired. I needed my retirement. My health is getting worse as I age. Like, I am not the young, spry guy I used to be. But you guys are asking me to do this. And I love my country so much. So if my country wants me, you know what? I will get up and I will help my country again. So I just love the genuine, I don't want to do this, but you're asking me to do it, so I'm going to do it for you guys attitude that Washington has. There's so often when, in the modern time, conservative Americans try to go for the Lincoln appeal. But it's amazing how rarely you see a figure in modern politics trying to emulate Washington in any way. And I think a large part of that is because, well, most people in Washington these days just are not, well, they're not lacking in confidence, to say the least. They tend to be, if anything, they have an excess of it. They're all very sure of themselves. They're all sure that they're correct and that they're making the right decisions and all of this stuff. But then here we have Washington, who is just like, I don't know. He's just here trying to, I'm sorry, my scroll is way too far. He's here just basically trying to help where he can. And that's all he wants to do. He just wants to help people. and he wants to help his country. Or let's just say he wants to help it, more so he wants to fulfill his duty to it when called upon. It seems like he wanted to just retire, honestly. But yeah, Washington is truly an interesting character. I think he should be inspiring to a lot of people because, like, people always talk about, like, oh, the cherry tree thing, that isn't real. I'm pretty sure that's not an actual thing. But his humility, even more than his appeal to just truth, truth and honesty, his appeal to humility is something that is severely lacking in the modern day. And I feel like, for me, when I listen to this speech, it talks to me on a personal level, because I can understand that feeling of just having that sense that you know your limitations and you're scared to really totally embrace a role because you know that there's parts of you that are not ready for it. And George Washington is one of the few leaders who comes out and just admits it. With both of these speeches, with his resignation and with his first inaugural address, he comes in and he says, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm right. I'm not sure that I'm good. But if you believe I'm right, if God has brought us to this position, then I will do my duty. And he makes no point more than he does this all out of love of country, fellow men, and God. I think that is a strong message that is severely lacking these days. But even if it's lacking these days, we still have access to these speeches. We can still go back and read these speeches as they were written, as they've been transcribed. And that is, I think, one of the most vital things that we could ever look at. In my entire education going through public schools, not once, for having a history class every year, for going through U.S. history, maybe 3 or 4 years, just U.S. history in grade school. Not once were we presented a speech by George Washington. And I think that is definitely a loss. I personally feel like not hearing a George Washington speech is something that is really it is an injustice to all of our people. But yeah, I'm not really, I don't really want to go too much into analyzing all of this. I know I've been talking for a bit, but for the most part, I just want people to kind of feel the emotion of what is being said here, because I feel like, while I generally hate arguments of pathos, it's important to understand what other people are feeling. It's important to understand both the morality, the ethics, and the emotions of other people. So that's where pathos and ethos are at their most vital. and looking at where George Washington is coming from, I feel like that is where you really want to. I feel like that's a great place to start. And it makes sense. It actually is very fitting that he would be our first president for this. And it's very fitting that he would be of no party. That's never going to happen again. So when I say this, I think it's really incredible. I like how he makes a reference to Adam Smith with the invisible hand here. Just as a small little bonus to point out. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. We are the most capitalistic society ever. At least that's what we were founded on. People making with their own and being guided by God. That was the idea. Anyhow, I think this is good. I really just want to get the chance to show some Washington to you guys. So I hope you liked it. This has been a fun one for me. I hope it's been fun for you. And remember, like, subscribe, follow me on social media if you want to. Follow me at commutationconstruct.locals.com and leave a comment below, because I really want to hear your thoughts on what Washington said, and definitely about Washington's personality, I think, more than anything else, because it isn't what you would think from a president looked back on as a great hero of American society. He is looked back on as this great, strong standing figure. And to see the timidity with which he speaks of himself, I believe that says a lot for his character, and it's kind of incredible, I think. So let me know your thoughts below, and I will see you later. Have a good one.